Hey guys, my name is Jeroen and in this video I'm gonna show you how to make the ultimate spotted turtle tank. Okay, let's get started. For this one we're gonna use the DIY aquarium I made a few weeks back. It measures 80 centimeters wide, 60 centimeters deep and 40 centimeters tall, which means it holds about 200 liters of water or about 50 gallons. The first thing I did was figuring out how I wanted to place this cork round. This will be the base of the land area, but because of its shape it will also be the main way the turtle will be getting out of the water. So it's really important I get this right. Next I cut off a corner so it would sit flush with the bottom of the tank. With a newly adjusted piece of cork in place, I took some measurements and transferred these to a piece of expanded PVC board. These pieces were then added underneath the cork and slowly adjusted until they matched its shape. Once those were in place, I used some super glue to hold them together. These were then attached using aquarium safe silicone. More silicone was then applied along the outside of the PVC board and smoothed out with my finger. This was then left to dry for 24 hours. While waiting for the silicone to cure, I made a few more modifications to the cork round. If I were to use this piece as is, there is a great chance it would destroy the scape. You see, this material is naturally very buoyant, and even though I will secure it in place, there's still a big risk that over time it will rip out and start to float. So to prevent that, I'm filling it up with these small rocks and lock these in place using black expanding foam. The next day I attached a 90-degree elbow hose connector to one of the bulkheads. The two bulkheads you see on screen right now are part of the filtration system. The one on the bottom will be the filter's intake and the one on the top will be the filter's return. Additionally, there's also a bulkhead behind the land area, which can be used if it ever overflows with water, but I'll talk more about that and the filtration system later on in the video. Next I want to address the filter's return. I wanted this to be in the front of the tank, but for ease of management the bulkhead needed to be in the back of the tank. To accommodate for this I attached the filter return piece to a length of tube. I laid the tube roughly where I needed it to be, scaped up a few rocks and then cut it to length. I attached the tube to the bulkhead and locked everything in place using some more foam. The tank was then taken out of the rack and set upright so I could apply some expanding foam on the inside. A few hours later, when the expanding foam had cured, I carved away from the outside of the land area. The idea was that the expanding foam would fill in all of the spaces between the cork bark and the PVC board. My guess was that it would most likely keep the inside watertight. However, after my first water test I discovered it was not watertight at all. Yeah, that sucks. But don't worry, we'll fix it later. First, you might be wondering why I filled up the land area with water instead of the other way around. Well, it's actually very simple. If this area can hold water in, it will also be able to hold water out. On top of that, the land area is equipped with a drain, so it's easier to get the water out of the tank once I fill it up. But now we gotta fix this leak. I did so by placing another piece of PVC board on the inside of the land area. This new piece is a bit taller than the previous one, reaching up almost as high as the piece of cork bark. This was attached using some more silicone. I made sure to use plenty, so there wouldn't be any cracks water could leak through. Now you may notice there's a gap left between the PVC board and the cork bark. No problem, we'll just fill this in with some expanding foam. Once dry, this was also carved away. However, this time my goal was to keep the surface as smooth as possible. The smooth surface allowed me to apply a layer of liquid rubber. This is important because I wanted to make sure it wouldn't leak again. After a few layers I felt confident to try again. I let this sit for an entire day. This time it held water perfectly. With the land area addressed, we can now continue scaping, but before we can do that, we need to thank today's sponsor. I'm just kidding, I don't have a sponsor. But if you like what you're seeing and you want to support the channel, you can do so by liking the video and subscribing down below. Thank you, it really helps out a lot. Now then, let's continue scaping. Before I can focus on the aesthetics, there's something else I need to make first. A basking area. I want this to be separate from the land area, so the heat lamp won't dry out the soil. I started to play around with a few cork rounds I had left over. This was my first idea. However, I think it might be a bit too steep for the turtle. After playing around with the materials for a bit, I came up with this. I really like this design since it gives the turtle a lot of space to walk around while not taking away that much from the water area. I used expanding foam to secure these pieces in place. I applied a little bit of foam on all of the contact points. In addition to the contact points, I also filled the entire inside of this horizontal piece with foam. With the basking area in place and the foam cured, we have now addressed all of the practical parts of this scape, which means we can now focus on aesthetics. I grabbed the remainder of the rocks and a piece of cork I have left over and started playing around with them in the tank. I was looking for something that felt natural to me. With a rough idea where I wanted everything to go, I emptied the tank again and turned it around. The tank was then laid on its back, and to make sure I wouldn't damage the bulkheads, I used a few boards. Next, I sprayed a layer of foam over the entire background and laid a few river rocks and pieces of cork on top of it. This was left to cure for a few hours. Next, I wanted to build up the right hand side of the tank. However, this time I felt filling in the entire wall with foam would be a waste of space and materials. I decided to use it only in a few select areas. I also used a few pieces of masking tape to hold a piece of cork upright, so I could create a branch. A few hours later I put the tank back upright and I'm really happy where this is going. There's one more side to go, but before we can scape that, there's one little thing we need to address. I don't want the filter's outlet to become covered in foam, so I'm taking it out and taping off the connection. And now we're ready to scape the final side. Before building up the hardscape, I secured the filter outlet to the glass. This is to make sure that it's pointing the right way once all the foam has cured. I then build up the background like before. A few hours later, all of the foam had finally cured, which means I could remove the tape and start carving the background. There are two reasons behind carving the background. First off, carving it will allow you to create any shape you like. And secondly, the silicone we're gonna add later will not adhere properly to the shiny surface of the foam, which means all the surfaces need to be cut. A few pieces of cork will later hold substrate, and to prevent water from building up inside, I drilled a few holes. And with that, the background is almost finished. The only thing we have to do now is cover everything, except for the hardscape elements, in a layer of this moisture wicking mesh. In theory, this will keep all of the walls of the Paludarium moist and provide a surface for moss to grow in. I also ran a strip of this fabric through the branch we created earlier. I then start placing beads of silicone around the background and placing the mesh over top. This was done for all the exposed areas in the background. Additionally, I also placed a few hands of sand throughout the scape. This was all left to cure for 24 hours. The next day I vacuumed out all of the excess sand, installed a strainer, cleaned up the glass, and did a final water test. After an entire day, it still held water, so I decided to move it over to the rack. Let's take a moment to talk about the equipment I'm using. The tank is lit using an Arcadia Pro T5 lighting kit equipped with a 6% forest light. Right behind that there's a simple 50 watt ceramic heater. On the filtration side of things, I'm using this external canister filter from Eheim. This particular one is rated for aquariums up to 250 liters of water, which is about 4 times the amount of water I'm using. This might sound a little bit overkill, but since turtles are really messy animals, good filtration is very important. Generally speaking, you want a filter that's rated for about 2 to 3 times the amount of water you plan on using. With that out of the way, let's get this thing ready for the plants. I started by pouring a layer of these clay balls into the land area. This will create a drainage layer if I ever overwater the plants. On top of that I added a layer of geotextile fabric. This way the substrate won't be able to mix with the clay balls, but water will still be able to pass through freely. Onto the substrate. This is a mixture of a few things. It's equal parts cocoa fiber, sand, charcoal, orchid bark and 2 parts sphagnum moss. I added a few hands of the substrate before adding a culture of springtails. These little creatures will address any mold outbreaks. Next I poured some play sand into the water area. This won't be able to support any plants, but as you see in a minute, that doesn't matter. Let's go over the plants. For this one I've got a Bulbidus heduloti, Bulbidus deformis mini, Ophiopocon Kyoto, Anubias barteri, Anubias nana petite, Anubias pinto, Bucephalandra green velvet, and a few cuttings of Hygrophila pinnatifida. But this isn't all of it. I've also got a few terrestrial plants. These include a Peperomia rosso, a few cuttings of Fittonia whitevane, oak leaf creeping fig, and a single deer fern. And before I forget, I've also got a few kinds of moss. Most of these mosses were collected outside, therefore I'm not 100% sure what species they are. If I make any mistakes, please correct me in the comments down below. But as far as I can tell, the mosses I have include peacock moss, live sphagnum moss, fern moss, pillow moss, thread moss, and haircap moss. Let's get this tank planted, shall we? I started out by placing moss around the land area. This was first wedged in between a few cracks I could find, but I later used superglue gel to attach it to the wall. The Peperomia was placed in the back of the design, with a few cuttings of Fittonia in front of it, alongside a few pieces of Ophiopocon, and of course a few more pieces of moss. I then filled the branches I created earlier with damp sphagnum moss. The shorter one will hold the deer fern, while the larger received some Bucephalandra. A bit of peacock moss was then placed over top. Onto our vines, the oak leaf creeping fig. The roots of these cuttings were wrapped in sphagnum moss and wedged in crevices throughout the scape. Something to note here is that I made sure that the roots of all these cuttings were in contact with or very close to the waterline. Next I continued placing moss throughout the scape. I used up all the moss I had available, trying to spread it out as evenly as possible. My goal is not to fill the entire background with moss. If all is done well, eventually the moss will start to grow and cover everything on its own. And now it's time for the bigger plants. I started by placing 2 of the Bulbidus heduloti near the back of the design. However, the one on the left was later moved to the front of the tank. Next I split up the Anubias barteri into 2 parts, The larger one was placed near the edge of the land area, while the smaller one was placed near the right hand side of the tank. The tank was then sprayed down to make sure none of the plants would dry out. Next I began placing some more pieces of Opiopogon throughout the scape. Just like the Anubias, this one was split up into smaller parts. I ended up with about 8 of these tiny pieces. Double Bitus deformis mini was then placed near the edge of the land area and on the right hand side of the tank. Hygrophila was placed in patches of moss throughout the background. I glued some peacock moss underneath the land area. The Anubias Nana Petite was then cut up in smaller pieces and placed underwater near the basking area. And finally the Anubias Pinto was split into 2 parts, one being planted on the edge of the land area and one being planted all the way in the front of the tank on the right hand side. And that concludes the initial planting of the setup. I filled the tank up with water, went to bed, and when I woke up the next day, the first thing I thought was, there's not enough moss. So I went out and got myself some more moss. This was glued to the background like before. I also added a few small pebbles. Next the tank was emptied once again, because I wanted to add some aquatic mosses. I added Christmas moss and Vicendis fontanus. The Vicendis was placed along the land area and on the left side of the tank. And the Christmas moss on the right side. Now I could fill the tank up once again. And finally I added some duckweed and Sylvinia minima. Now before I can show you the beauty shots, there are a few things I would like to address. First off, this tank is set up around the needs of an adult turtle. However, the one I'm getting will still be a baby. And because the babies of this species are really bad swimmers, I need to make a few adjustments. First off, the water line is way too high right now. Right now the water is about 17 centimeters deep. I need to lower it to around 5 centimeters. Next I'll be getting a few more pieces of driftwood which I will place around the water area. This is to make sure the baby has a lot of places where it can climb out of the water and rest if it wants. Both of these changes will be temporarily though. Once the turtle is old enough, I will be taking the wood out and filling the water back up again. And then there's one more thing I would like to say before I show you the beauty shots. Building something like this is not a weekend project. From start to finish, this one took me about a month to make, which still feels kind of rushed. So if you want to try to build something like this, be sure to take your time. That said, I really hope I can inspire someone to make something like this. Alright, onto the beauty shots. And there you have it, the ultimate spotted turtle tank. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see how I built the tank itself, I think you should watch this video next.